Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support and the recent content. We are moving through the West, with our offseason breakdowns. We do have a comment from YT_Eli2643 on our short about the Spurs. He said, I got them making the play and might sneak into the playoffs. I think that's a very valid argument. We kind of talked about the potential possibility of them doing that if Wemby, elevates his game, which I think everybody knows that he will. And obviously the surrounding pieces also have to be better. And yeah, I think they've kind of primed that up a little bit, with the talent upgrades that they made, and the level of seriousness that they did add to the team. I think it is a possibility that they could, sneak into the play in a little bit. I wouldn't say guaranteed lock, but definitely a possibility.
Right. Yeah. Like you said, I'm not quite there on I think they're going to get in there, but I think that they will be better. And I think that, again, the best version of Wemby plus, whatever other things happen with this team over the course of the season, plus the veterans, plus the contributions of the young guys, that could possibly, that might be the ceiling. But again, if that's the ceiling, I feel like that may be a little bit less likely. But it's possible if you get, a really, really, again, like a top 10, second team All NBA, at least third team All NBA, but closer to like second team Wemby, which again, that's a tall task. Not because necessarily just him, but just the rest of the talent in the league. But he could do it because, again, he was already better than I think what everybody kind of expected as a rookie. So, if he continues to progress like that, because a lot of these teams and a lot of these players, once these guys get in, they show how generational they are, these teams become a lot better really quickly, right? Like, say, look back at, say, like LeBron's teams earlier, where like maybe they missed the playoffs the first year or so, and then right after that, boom, then they're making the playoffs every year, right? And and you can go back and look at a lot of these other guys, right? Same thing. So
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting. It kind of begs the debate. Like, yeah, I think Wemby's probably going to have to win DPOY as well. And also the Spurs are going to have to be very elite on defense as well, to kind of
yep.
push for that, that play-in spot. But, before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so now, as you already mentioned, we're moving our way through the rest of the Western Conference, and this
Yes,
time
sir.
around, we're still going through the Southwest Division. We're in the last of the Texas teams, the Houston Rockets, right? So obviously, we had already covered the Spurs and the Mavs. If you want to check our thoughts on those teams, you can check out those videos.
Yes, sir.
But now we're in the Houston Rockets, right? So, which is a different team, from the Mavs, and also, I guess, from the Spurs as well, right? Because you look at the Rockets team. They've undergone a rebuild, right, similar to the Spurs, right, but obviously they had already kind of continued to collect talent. They've collected several lottery picks over the last few years. Not the Spurs haven't, right, but the Rockets have also had some other picks as well.
Mm-hmm.
But last year kind of culminated into like the first real serious year for this team in the post Harden era, right? Because obviously, right, you had the years with Harden where when he was there, they were a playoff team every year. Had a couple years where it looked like they had a real shot to possibly make the finals and win a championship. It just didn't quite work out, right? Then he asks out. He gets moved to Brooklyn, and obviously we know everything that happens from there on out, right? They go in the tank, and then they collect picks over the last few years. And then obviously we had talked about it because we had talked about it, a year ago in our podcast, right? With the Rockets where they were bad, and it wasn't just that they were bad, they looked awful. They looked disorganized. They looked like a mess, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously they fired their coach, right? Who clearly, it wasn't working there, right? Didn't seem like there was a lot of respect from the players in that regard, even though he seems like a nice guy, seems like a very smart guy as well. But then obviously last year, then they went the opposite direction, right? They got Ime Udoka from the Boston Celtics, right? Who had obviously been embroiled in some controversy, right? But he came in and kind of righted the ship, cleaned some stuff up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the team looked more like a real basketball team, right? They finished 500. They were actually, in the beginning part of the year, they were actually a playoff team, and they were one of the best defensive teams. Then they kind of fell off, and then they were really bad, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, they go on an 11-game winning streak towards the end of the year, right? And then they kind of get to 500, right? They have a couple of, big games because they had a lot of games against some bad teams, but it doesn't matter. They still won 11 straight, which was better than what they had done in any previous year in quite a while. And then, again, they ultimately missed the playoffs. They ended up having the third pick, right, in the NBA draft, right? Although it did not belong to them, right? It belonged to another team. But either way, regardless, right? The Rockets had for them a successful season, right? They finished 500. They were ninth in defensive rating. They were 20th in offensive rating, right? And those numbers were, kind of, they changed a lot over the course of the year. But, we know they were a bad defensive team for a while, right? In the post-Harden era, which makes sense. It was a young team, didn't have like a lot of great defensive players, but, they had been building something, right? Obviously, last offseason, we talked about it where they made some good moves. It was kind of funny because we know that their offseason was weird, right? Because contracts, you had the big contract to Fred VanVleet, but we talked about it. It was fine because it wasn't long. The Dylan Brooks contract was long, but it was one that would go down, each year, right? It was less money on a per year basis. And then they also had some other strange signings, but overall we thought it was a good offseason for them. And, I think they ended up honestly being better than I think we expected.
100%.
Because we didn't expect them to make the playoffs, even when they were winning games, but still, regardless, right? We didn't expect them to be 500. We knew they'd be better, but we still thought they'd be not that great. And again, it took an 11-game winning streak to get there. But regardless, it's an interesting team to look at, right? Because,
Hmm.
with this offseason in mind, they didn't really do a whole lot, essentially, right? Like, you look at what they did, and it was mainly what they did in the draft, right? Where they drafted Reed Shepherd third overall, right? The guard out of Kentucky, right? One of the best shooters in college basketball, right? Was, basically almost a 50% three-point shooter in college. Don't expect him to be a 50% three-point shooter as a rookie, but, again, he's coming in with a hopefully, right, already established skill set. He looked great in the summer league, right? He even played a little bit of point in the summer league, which, again, given his size, right, he may have to be like, kind of a point guard ish type player, right?
Yeah.
He might end up like long term being a combo guard. We'll see. But either way, there's lots to like about him, right? He's clearly a very competitive guy. Already talked about he's coming in with a very high level skill set that the Rockets need, right? Because the Rockets, they have a lot of guys that, are not amazing 3-point shooters, right? Like last year, they were 23rd in 3-point percentage, right? Which
Hmm.
is, not that great, right? That's
Hmm.
in the bottom third of the league. But again, there's a lot of players on the team that I like, but I think just the fact that you have a guy like that, that's a guy that should be able to help on the offensive end, which was a weakness for them last year, right? And part of that also stems from, like we mentioned, compared to, say, like the Spurs are in a rebuild, but they may be able to, I don't know, they might be able to get to where they want to go maybe at a faster rate, like maybe at a faster exponential rate because of the fact that they already have a number one guy in Wemby. Well, with the Rockets, right, they have a number of good players, but we don't really know if any of those guys are going to be true number one guys, right? Because, like, you see Alperen Şengün, he's really good.
Yeah.
Um, but, can he truly be like the best player on a really good team, right? We don't know yet, right? Just because of the fact that they haven't been in any like real, high level competitive games yet. They have, obviously had a great year last season. He averaged 21 a game, 9 rebounds, 5 assists, just over a steal, just under a block, 54 from the field. Even took a few more threes, but still not a lot. 30% clip, 69 from the free throw line. So, not that amazing, but again, overall, like a really good year for him.
Hmm.
And then obviously Jalen Green, right? That's the other guy where that was their, true lottery pick, right? He was the second pick overall in the draft back in 2021, and he came in with a lot of promise.
Yeah.
And he didn't, even though the numbers looked fine, right, the first couple of years, it didn't feel like he could really be, like a true number one guy, right? Like a true go-to player. Then even last year, right? He didn't have a great year for most of the year, but then all of a sudden, right, when they went on that win streak, right, he played like a maniac, right, like a monster. Like every night we were talking about, like how awesome, he was playing, during that winning streak last season. I mean, you look at his, you look at what he was doing for the month of March. He was averaging 28 points a game, 6 rebounds and 4 assists, 50 from the field, 41 from three, right?
Hmm.
Compared to if you look around most of the year, right, like say, in the month after that, April, he gave you 17, 5, and 4, 38 from the field, 29 from three.
Yeah.
right? Before the month of March in February. He gave you just 16 a game, right? 37 from the field, 26 from three. So really, that's kind of the issue there is that, the consistency hasn't been necessarily what we would like to see, for a guy of that caliber, right? Other really good young players on the team, right? Jabari Smith Jr., right? He was the third pick overall back in 2022. In his second season, he showed some good improvement, right? The points per game ticked up only a little bit, up to 14, but he gave you 8 rebounds, just under a block, just under a steal, and shot 45 from the field and 36 from three, way up from what he was doing last year. So that's solid. And then you look at some of these other guys, right? Amin Thompson, right, who was their rookie last year, right? He started the year off, kind of hurt, didn't really play a whole lot, and then as they had injuries to some guys on the roster, then all of a sudden, right, he was playing great, right? Like he finished the season averaging just under 10.6 rebounds, and shot 54 from the field, right? But his best play came during that winning streak, right? When they were putting him at center, kind of taking advantage of the fact that, like, yeah, he can't really shoot, but he's a great athlete, right? And he's a really good defender, very high energy guy, rebounder, shot blocker, things like that.
Hmm.
So, Tari Eason, right, was unavailable during the latter part of the season due to injury. As was Cam Whitmore, right, who was a guy that was poised to be a lottery pick, and then he just falls all the way down basically to 20, right? And Houston basically steals him. And then you look around at the rest of the roster. We talked about it. The veterans, right? Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks gave them good seasons last year, right? Their contracts were kind of maligned, obviously, because of the fact of who they are, versus how much they got paid. But with like Dylan Brooks, I mean, he shot over 40%. The efficiency dropped, over the course of the season. But that's just because, again, they didn't have a real go-to guy. But he still gave you, 13 a game, 3.5 rebounds, and shot 43 from the field, 36 from three, which had been better than it had been, right? Because the year before in Memphis, he shot like 39%, from the field, right? Actually, him and Fred VanVleet, were very much noted for their inefficiencies as offensive players, right? And again, like, the numbers dropped over the course of the season, you know, because there were stretches where they weren't as good, but the numbers were still good. Like, VanVleet gave you 17 points, 8 assists, a steal and a half, just under a block. Even at age 30, right? Because we know he's, only going to get a little bit older, but he's still giving you good production. So there's a lot of players to like on this team, including both the vets and the younger guys. It's just really the main question now is, can Jalen Green or Şengün kind of grow into actual number ones, right? Because if people hadn't noticed, those guys haven't gotten, their rookie extensions yet, right? They haven't been paid yet. And there's a lot of questions about whether or not those guys are going to get paid because of the fact that, we're still kind of, not that they're not good, but we're just still not quite sold as to, like, can these truly be franchise guys? And that's probably also why, there was a deal that happened earlier, right, in the offseason, right before the draft, where the Rockets and the Nets made a deal where the Rockets gave back, the picks that they got from Brooklyn in the James Harden deal, and in return they got the picks from the Phoenix Suns that Brooklyn got in the Kevin Durant deal. So now Brooklyn has their own picks, so they can tank to their heart's content, and the Rockets presumably now have the Suns picks to go after whomever they want to go after in the future, right? It was kind of suggested maybe they might go after Durant, and they might entice the Suns into being like, hey, there's a get out of jail free card. You can have your picks back. If you want to bail on this, right? Probably won't happen, but you just never know. It kind of just depends on how the Sun situation goes. But more importantly, at least with the Rockets, you have some flexibility, to, if you don't like some of the, young guys on your roster, or if you don't feel like that you really want to pay those guys, you could, in theory, right, when a situation arises, move on and make some big deals. So they have a lot of options, now, both for the present and in the future. But we still need to see, like I said, ultimately what we're gonna really get out of Green and Şengün. Because again, we know, at least, I think Şengün, like, if I had to guess right now, would probably be the one that's more likely to get, if they were to get paid, it'd be more likely that it would be him, because I think he's been a little bit more proven, and we've seen more evidence of per year progression. Whereas with Green, it's just been kind of up and down, right? Where you don't necessarily love it. But, there's a world where they both play great, and then going into the offseason as restricted free agents, they get paid. I'm just curious as to whether or not Houston does it. But obviously, for now, right, in terms of what they did this offseason, again, most of their tough offseason stuff was really last season because they had a bunch of cap space and they signed a bunch of guys. But now, right, this was more so just kind of adding on to what they already did. And I like the Reed Shepard pick. And and it went under the radar, but I like the fact that they made the trade with those draft picks between them and Brooklyn. So that combination, I think, again, I think that's a B, a solid B from me. Just because, again, like my expectation of what they could do wasn't, through the roof because I didn't expect them to go all in and make some crazy trade for a star. And we knew that they were kind of probably draft Reed Shepard because he was mocked there. Almost everybody thought he was going to go there. But the Brooklyn thing, the picks kind of came out of nowhere, so that adds on to it. But it's still a good offseason, right? Obviously, it won't. You wouldn't expect it to top last year's just because there weren't as many changes with the roster. But it was a good one. And again, like I said, there's a lot of young players to like on this roster. Even as I already mentioned, Cam Whitmore, what does he look like in year 2? But regardless, they did a good job. And also, I forgot at the deadline, which again, this wasn't this offseason, but last year's trade deadline, they acquired Steven Adams. So that adds another additional big man that they can have off the bench, which they didn't really have last year, right? It was kind of just running guys that, I get know that they had like a Jock Landale, and others, right? But, now at least you have another bruising physical guy to put out there if he can be healthy, because we have not seen him play in a very long time because he missed all of last year and he hasn't played since, late last season. Well, late 2 seasons ago now because that other last season just ended. So,
Mm-hmm.
since early 2023.
Yeah. Um, I feel like context matters with this team. It's a very I think it's a tough team to gauge at times because you want to be so high on, all the potential, but I think you do have to look at the back end where it's like if these guys flop, then it probably doesn't look too good. Granted,
Mm-hmm.
the thing that is awesome about this roster is you can pretty much easily pivot if you really want to because all of these contracts are very tradable. They're not locked in, with anybody with some like serious kind of max money, that I think will presumably be happening probably next season. Like you said with Shingun, I would probably have to guess. But yeah, I would give them a B for this offseason just because I think it's just that thought in the back of my head that's wondering like if this doesn't work out, then it's bad because I feel like if there was more certainty about it, then I would give it an A 100% because you added on a guy like Reed Shepard and then gave yourself a little bit of flexibility with some draft picks as well. But the problem is there isn't a solid identity yet. Granted, I think the thing that we do have to take into account is they haven't been very healthy, like you already talked about. Cam Whitmore missing time, who seemed to be taking a leap. Tari Eason as well. Steven Adams, like a lot of those guys miss time. And another thing about context too, when Jalen, this is another thing. I think we have questions about the fit as well because when Jalen Green was popping off, Şengün was out, if I'm not mistaken. Like,
Yeah,
so
I think
who's the number one here?
yeah, I
Because it
think
doesn't link.
early on,
What's up?
yeah, I think early on maybe Shingun was there, but the vast majority of this was without Shingun.
Yeah, like that later part in the season where Jalen Green was going on that tear. I'm pretty sure Şengün was like done. But
Mm,
regardless, like I think it raises a question like can they even fit together? Can they play together? Um, and I think Şengün's been more consistent, but the upside of Jalen Green and what he can do athletically, if he can just shoot the ball, it kind of goes back to the same thing with the Thompson twin, Amin. Same thing where it's like if these guys can get a jumper, consistent jumper, not just like a month of lights out shooting. Like we need a full season of you consistently being a threat from the 3 point line. Um,
right.
Couple that with Şengün's, baby Jokic playmaking ability, I think there is a possibility for the team to look a crap ton better than last year. But at the same time, that's a lot of stock to put into a guy who hasn't really taken a leap in Jalen Green. I think it really all comes down to Jalen Green. Another guy I think that's slept on defensively would be Jabari Smith Jr. I think, what he was able to do last season, he looked a lot better, than the
Yeah.
previous season. So shout out to him. I think he's been looking good. And they have a bunch of pieces. That's the cool thing. The amount of young core players that they do have at their disposal is awesome, and you kind of expect nothing less than them to keep moving on up. But you do have some players that can easily stagnate, I think. But the cool thing is, like you said, with Reed Shepard, bringing a guy like that in, he seems NBA ready, and that's awesome because he can immediately make an impact off the bench. I think we all know that he's probably not going to start just because of, who they're paying right now and who they're playing and who they have on the roster. But regardless, he's going to be a help. And I think, I'm really expecting all these young guys to just take it up a notch, really.
Right, because that's the thing is that it feels like that there's some in between. Like Van Vliet and Dylan Brooks are kind of like in between guys, where it's like
Sure.
5 years from now, they probably still won't be on the team, right, as
Yeah.
starters,
Yeah.
right. Let's say like 5 years from now, like if they pay them and keep them, right, then like Jalen Green and Şengün,
Yeah.
and Smith and these other guys, right, like they're not going to keep everybody, but
Right.
that's why again it's a lot easier to make the decision to keep them if those guys truly progress. Because if Jalen Green doesn't just have one good month, but one great season,
Yeah.
right? If he can put that all together from start to finish, then he'll be much more likely to be a long term piece, right?
And there were
Because if
there were
he had,
talks of him getting traded last year. I remember it.
yeah, right, yeah, for I think it was for Mikal Bridges,
Yeah, which is
and
crazy.
I think yeah, and the Nets I think ended up turning it down, um, right? So Houston was clearly okay with it, but
Yeah.
Brooklyn was not. But again, if he can do that, if he can improve the consistencies, right, then that's where he can shine, right, and that's where he can be a real part of this group. He just hasn't shown it yet consistently. Even because again, that's the main question: is was that month that we saw, was that really him? Is that
Yeah.
actually what we're going to see from him this upcoming season? Or are we going to just see more of the same where it's like, because early in the season, he was not good at all,
He
right? He was
wasn't
like
even
the one young,
playing. He was getting like
yeah,
benched and wasn't
right.
even
Yeah. He was,
closing. Dark.
yeah, he was exactly. Yeah. He was the main young guy that was playing poorly, where, like you said, he was getting benched in crunch time. He was just looked out of place and out of
Yeah.
sorts, right? But again, it's, the way that they're playing now is such a huge change from what they were doing before, where now you can't just get away with doing whatever you want to do, right? Udoka is not going to let you do that, because he, and not that the previous coach Silas didn't want to win, right? Because I'm sure he did. It's just obviously it's a different personality, and it's just a different level of I guess respect for the coach. And I think with Udoka, right, he's a more proven coach, right, and he's just better, right. Obviously, prior to being in Houston, he led the Celtics to the finals. They didn't win, but it was still quite an accomplishment, regardless.
Yeah.
And and he had already kind of been a guy that had been pegged as like a next, really good option for a coach
Mm-hmm.
before he became the head coach in Boston. Anyways, he
Mm-hmm.
got that label while he was an assistant.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot to like there. It's just really the question of there's so many young guys on this team, and we know that they are not going to pay all of them. So which guys ultimately will actually be here long term? And that's the ultimate question. Is that we don't know all the guys that will be here long term, because there's a lot of guys that project to be, if they reach whatever their ceiling is, could be really good, but we don't know if they're going to get there yet. But like you said, there were positive signs for a lot of young players, because as you mentioned, Jabari Smith Jr., right? He improved on both ends of the floor. And we already knew that, like, defensively, he had some pretty good qualities about him, but you were also hoping to see more on the offensive end too, because it didn't look as good as a rookie, but he improved
Mm-hmm.
in year two, right? Again, all these other guys, kind of a similar thing, but it's just a real question, because again, even with Şengün, as good as he is, like I said, do you want to pay him 200 something $1 million, over the course of 5 seasons? You probably would like to see a little bit more, even though again he's already really good. And then obviously same thing with Jalen Green too, right? Like I don't think feel comfortable as of right now giving him a 5 year, $200+ million
They
deal out
clearly
of Gillette.
don't. They
Right? Yeah.
haven't. And he was on the
Right.
trade
Yeah.
block, and it's tough because I feel like I said, his positives for sure outweigh the negatives, but
Mm,
I think the negatives outshine the positives at the moment, where
right.
it's like, the isolation ball, the brain dead stuff like that. It's like, all
Mhm.
right, man, like we got to lock in here because you have some
Yeah.
athletic gifts that, if used with the smart basketball IQ could make you, one of the
Mhm.
most unstoppable players in the league.
Yeah. And they had also acquired AJ Griffin,
Ah,
but
yes.
that may not necessarily come to fruition because it
Right.
sounds like he may step away from the game. We'll see what happens there. But either way, like I said, they still have a lot of solid young players. But again, what makes me kind of skeptical to pick them, as like a surefire, oh yeah, they're going to be one of the 10 teams in the Western Conference that has a chance to make the playoffs is, I just need to see more, ultimately. And that's that. And not, and again, it's a young team. So in theory, we should be seeing more anyways. It's just, again, most of the teams above them already have a guy that we know what we're going to get, pretty much every night, right?
Yes,
Like,
sir.
Memphis will be back in that 10 and we know what Ja can do. And then you look around, right? Obviously, with the Nuggets, we know what Jokic can do. Not going to go over every team, right? But like, Denver, OKC, Minnesota, Dallas, right? We know all of them.
Hmm.
Even the other teams that have a chance that might fall out of the, top 10 or 8 or whatever, right? Like say, like maybe Golden State or LA, or
Hmm.
somebody like that, right? They still have guys that at least we know what we're going to get from them, pretty much every night. We're not there with Houston, but they have so many, solid young players, so much depth, that they should still be able to win a decent number of regular season games. It's just, again, I don't know. It's just like I don't know if I can automatically pencil them in for, a top 10 spot, because I mean it's because in theory they're on the trajectory to. It's just, I guess the main question would be who would be falling out of the top 10 if that was the case. And it would, in theory, also probably have to be two, because if we're also assuming that Memphis is going to be in the top 10 and Houston, well, that's two teams, right? Now, maybe it might be one of those Pacific division teams, right? Maybe it is LA, the Lakers, the Warriors, or even the Clippers, right? Or somebody like that. But I don't know. Like that's the tough part, is that they're gonna have to, I think, kind of win out against some other teams that I think are, worst case scenario about as good as them, or or better. But they have the ability to do it. It's just, I think, in order to be, because in order to be significantly better, I think one of Green or Shengun would need to take a big leap. Probably more so Green, because Shengun's already good. So if Green took a leap where it's like, all right, he's now one, and then Shengun is like 1A or 2 or something like
Hmm.
that, that'd be cool. But, who knows, right? But do you expect it? I guess, like, do you think that we're actually going to get, February Jalen Green or March Jalen Green or whatever it was, like the entire season? Or do you think it's more likely that, maybe it's like somewhere in between? Like, and maybe that's kind of a cop out, but I guess it's like, which one do you buy is the one, which version of Jalen Green do you think is the more likely one we get next season? The one closer to what we saw most of last year, or the one that we got where he was giving you like 30 a game?
I don't think he blossoms. If you want me to be real, I don't think he
Okay.
turns into you know that month. I don't think we get that. And that's just and that's not even really me being like negative Nancy or anything like that. I'm really trying to just be realistic here. Um, we haven't really seen it yet. We only saw it for 1 month. And granted, the guy's a highlight machine. Like he walks away with a game, a highlight from every game. But that
Mhm.
highlights don't equal winning basketball. So that's kind of my concern. What I will say is I'm high on the team, not necessarily because of Jalen Green, but because of the other pieces. I expect Jabari Smith
Okay.
Jr. to take a leap. I expect Amin Thompson to take a huge leap. I expect, a lot of these guys to gel and mesh together very well because they've got a ton of freak athletes. And once again, athleticism to me equals, you have defensive potential. And then adding a guy like Reed Shepard just makes me feel comfortable about the team as a unit per se, more than,
Hmm.
Jalen Green's individual success. I just don't foresee
Okay.
that happening. I think Shengun is the better option long term.
Okay. And I think I'm kind of there with you for the most part as well, where I feel like, I don't expect him to be awful or bad or anything, but I don't know if I don't know. I don't know if I feel like that version may not be what we're gonna get. I feel like
Yeah.
it might just be closer to what it already was, but maybe a little bit better. And that may be enough, but I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't think that the version that we saw was the same.
Yeah.
Was indicative of what we're gonna see, but we'll
Not at
see.
all.
Um, and then
It's
after
possible
that,
though.
right? Yeah, exactly. And then after that, Fred Van Vliet, right? So after this season, he'll have a team option. So I guess the question is, what happens with those veteran guys, right? Like say
Mm,
with I mean, Brooks, he's still got 3 more years, no option at all,
mhm.
right? But Van Vliet after this year, he's got the team option. So like, what do you expect? Because we don't expect a drop off from those guys, even though they're 29, Dylan Brooks, and 30, Fred Van Vliet,
Mhm.
respectively. But I guess like there's so much depth, right? That like let's say we fast forwarded, you know, 2 seasons from now, are these both of these guys still on the team? And
O
then if not, right, who kind of slides in to take their places?
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm gonna go NFL here. There's a term in the NFL called bridge quarterback. So I guess we could use that analogy for the NBA. Let's call Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks bridge players, all right? Um,
Yeah.
so what I'm thinking is gonna happen is I think Reed Shepard, if he projects to be the guy, he could potentially take the
Hmm.
reins from Fred Van Vliet. Because I think the thing with Reed Shepard is he's sneaky athletic and he's also sneaky okay at defense as well. Kind of similar
Hmm.
archetype to Fred Van Vliet. So if he's, learns behind Fred Van Vliet and then ends up taking a leap in his, I guess, second year or whatever, then it's like, okay, well then we really need a Fred Van Vliet on the team? And then obviously you have Amon Thompson as well, who's kind of projected as a point guard as well. So
Hmm.
if either of those guys can kind of compete for the starting spot, while Van Vliet is still on the team, while soaking up all of the veteran knowledge that he does bring, because I think people forget that he is an NBA champion as well. So I think, if they progress and he kind of regresses, but it's in a good way, if that makes sense, where it makes sense for
Yeah.
the team and the timeline more so than like individual player success and stuff like that, then I would say he probably isn't on the team, and then one of those two guys slides into that spot, and I would probably go with Reed just based off the pure shooting ability, and the other stuff I think will come with time in the league.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. It's just kind of interesting because you look around the roster and there's like, there's almost like in theory, kind of like 11, 12 guys that might compete for minutes, but we know all of them probably aren't going to play.
Mm-hmm.
And, like you said, it's going to ultimately kind of come down to which guys kind of show out the most, and earn the minutes, right? Because
Yeah.
there are some guys that will probably be on their way out, right? Like Jay Sean Tate probably
Mm.
be on his way out, of Houston,
Mm-hmm.
right? And,
Forgot
just
about him.
yeah, he's an older, he's not old, right? But he is 29, right? And he's, feels like he's probably, I know he's extension eligible, but it seems like he's probably on his way out,
Yeah.
right? As like one of those guys where they probably just kind of bring in somebody else, right? Like obviously they, Jeff Green's still here. He's 38.
Yeah.
But he's a veteran guy, right? Who, can still play, but obviously if these other guys, progress and continue to play, his minutes will probably, drop off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Aaron Holiday, same thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
but that's what you want. You want the younger guys to progress and get more of those minutes so that way you don't have to rely on those older guys as much, right? Just because of the fact that the younger guys, presumably the talent should be progressing, and the experience should be able to get to them to a point where they're comfortable enough to play big minutes. And again, in that winning streak, there were a lot of competitive games at different points. And that should be really big for a lot of those guys going into next season anyway. So there is a lot to like. It's just again, I'm just still skeptical of whether or not I can say truly pencil them into that play-in spot. I just don't really know. The
Mm-hmm.
over/under for Vegas has them at 43 and a half, which is basically tied with both the Lakers and the Warriors, right? So, right above the Rockets is the Heat, right? But if you're just looking above them in terms of the West, it's the Pelicans at 46 and a half. So that's, a difference of 3 games, right? So basically they have the Rockets pegged in right where the Lakers and Warriors are, and then the Clippers are right below them at 39 and well, not right below, but below them at 39 and a half, and then the Spurs at 36 and a half. So, that basically means that they think that they'll be, I guess, standings wise, about what they were last year, right? Because, if you look at the makeup of the West with these over unders, I mean, you have kind of the usual suspects, right, in the top four, right? And then after that, right, then you have like, your Grizzlies, Suns, Kings, Pelicans, right? So basically they have like the Rockets like in that 9, 10, 11 spot, right? So that's, you know, somewhere between 9 and 12 is probably the most likely scenario for them, right? They could be as high as like 8, 9, or as low as like, 11, 12, depending on what happens. But I think a successful year, like they would probably consider a successful year as, can we get into the play-in worst case scenario? Like if they're not in the play-in at all, that they would probably consider that a bad year, since that's what happened last year, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know if I would expect them. I don't know if I'm gonna expect them to get into the top 10, but they can do it though for sure.
I'll go ahead and say they can do it.
Yeah.
And I think they will. Like I
Okay.
said, the reasoning is probably a lot different than other people. Like a lot of people are still super high on Jalen Green. They haven't sold their stock. I'm not selling my stock. I'm just kind of being realistic about it.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think it's going to be a culmination of things more so than just one player's individual numbers and stuff like that, and what his progression looks like. You said the over under was 43. I think that
Yeah.
there's no
Yep.
there's no excuse for them to go under. And that's just keeping it real because they went 500 last year. In theory, everybody's getting better. So what does that mean? You as a team getting better should equal more wins. And I think 2 wins is easy enough
Yeah.
for them to go
That's
over.
cool. Yeah, and like I said, I feel like there's a world where they could get to 43 wins and it could still put them at 11th in the Western Conference.
Sure.
So,
I penciled them
and
in
I
at
think
9 though. I'm gonna just say
yeah.
that right here.
And again, that's where Vegas has them. And again, like it makes sense because you look at the teams around them, right? They're not gonna, they're those teams, like the Lakers have done basically nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But, obviously the Rockets don't have, some of the guys at the top, even though they have a more balanced roster.
Yes.
The Warriors, they made moves, but, and technically they were already better than Houston, right? They won 46 games. But, are they going to be better than 46 games?
No.
I don't know. And then the Clippers will be worse than they were last year, right? Because they
Yes.
were 50-win team. So, obviously Vegas has them doing significantly worse. And that's the team where I feel like the Rockets could probably finish better than them just because of the fact that, like, if Kawhi misses any significant time,
Which
then
he
that's
will.
probably, lights out for the Clippers, right? So
Yeah.
that's where I could see them finishing like 9, 10, because I feel like, okay, you could move over the Clippers.
Yeah.
And then, obviously we'll see what happens with these other teams, but, because like say the Kings and the Pelicans, right? They're at 46.5, right? Compared to the Rockets 43.5. The Grizzlies are at 47.5. And obviously, we'll get into those over-unders, kind of spoilers anyways, but doesn't matter. We'll cover these teams regardless. But yeah, I'd say I feel like I could see them finishing like maybe 10. I think I have them probably like around 10.
Yeah.
Because I think they could climb up a spot. But higher than 9, I think would be a little surprising to me. But again, either way, it's also going to, to be fair, because of all the injuries that their guys had, that's a world where like, okay, if they're all healthy, right, then that could be a really good thing for them because then they can see easier, like, all right, a guy like Atari Eason who didn't play, even though they went on that big winning streak. All right, if he's healthy, maybe they could get a big winning streak against a string of good teams.
Yeah.
And like you said, if there's continued progression from these other young guys, that'll help. It's just I feel like one of Green or Shengun, I think, might have to be better for them to get higher than 9. But
Okay.
if they are like a little better, then that'll probably be enough to get them like in the 9-10 spot. Because I,
Yeah.
I just feel like I could see one of those 3 teams, maybe 2 of them, falling below.
Yeah.
But
Agreed.
not by like a ton, because it's going to probably be like last year where it's like, you know, a difference of 1 or 2 games could be the difference between like 3 or 4 playoff spots.
Yeah. Exactly.
Like, because that's the difference. Because like before, like say 5 years ago, once you got to like even in the Western Conference, which was still really good, there was a stretch where like once you got out of the top 8, 9, or something like that, then there was like a big difference in the amount of wins. Whereas like now, like say a team like Golden State was 10 and they won 46 games, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a world where Houston could get to 46, but because every other team, maybe all those teams above them win 1 extra game, then they still finish, like I said, 10th or something like that. But
Yeah.
again, I think the Rockets will still will continue to look good. It's just, again, the question is the stretches of the season, right? So like early in the season, after their poor start, I think, and then late in the season when they had that winning streak, can they put that together for a bigger chunk of the season, right? Because last year we saw flashes, we saw stretches where the team was really good, but we never really got to see the best version of the team for more than like, a few weeks or so.
Yeah.
But if can you get that, can you get that from, one or two high level months of play to maybe 3 months, three high level months of play, right? Because the regular season, that goes from October to April, so that's 6 months. So if for half the season you're playing at a high level, right, versus like 2 months, that could be the difference between like 41 games and 45, 46 games. And that's where you could probably get into the play in with 46 wins, but I don't think 41 wins would be enough.
No, no,
And it wasn't last year,
no,
because
yeah.
again, the Warriors won 5 more games than they did. So if you believe that the Rockets will get into the play-in, you'd have to pick over. So, I mean, I think both you and I are going to be over. I think the only real difference is like where we think they'll finish in the standings, but like that's not even that different. Like if you
Yeah.
say 9 and I'm like 10, I mean, that's a difference
Same
of
thing.
1 or 2 games.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yes, sir.
but regardless, is there anything else that you would expect? Like, is there like a young guy, of the last couple of drafts, that we didn't talk about a ton that you expect to take a decent leap in year 2 or 3?
Cam Whitmore.
Okay.
It kind of goes back to the question that you posed, about like Dylan Brooks and like, what happens when they want to move on from him, who slots into that role. I think Cam could do it. He's he's got the gunslinger chucker mentality.
Mm-hmm.
I think his athleticism can for sure be transferred into defense. And yeah, he's a playmaker for sure, and he gets buckets. So that would kind of be cool to see him, step up and elevate as the years go by. But I think he's kind of on track to be a steal in the draft.
Yeah, and that's kind of what you're hoping for is, the stuff without the ball
Yeah,
is ideal because it's unlikely that he's going to play a ton with the ball in his hands just because of who he's also playing alongside. But if he can continue to improve as a catch and shoot guy, we know he can be an elite cutter because, as you
yeah,
mentioned, he's a ridiculous athlete. And then if he can continue to improve his defense, right, he could easily be, I don't want to say like 3 and D because that sounds kind of generic, but he could easily be like a solid, all around,
yeah,
player
yeah,
where, all of a sudden, like, yeah, like even though we know he's a scorer, right, he can still get offense, and if he can get his offense more in a team style setting, right, that's where he'll be really valuable because
yeah, for
again,
sure.
we saw it in the summer league. You could see he got better each game, right? Because early on in some of the early games, it didn't look as good, but you could kind of see moments, right? But then he improved. And then even in the regular season, right? Because he didn't play a lot early in the season. Then eventually he got minutes and was productive in those minutes, right? Then eventually, unfortunately, the season was cut short due to an injury. But if he can carry that into next season, and again, just improve from a team player standpoint, and kind of get out of just the, I have to be, like a one-on-one scorer type guy. Not that he can never do it. It's just on this team in this setting and really in the NBA, that's not going to be, the best role for him.
Yeah,
Where, like if you're trying to map out like what's the best way for him to stick around and get paid, it's not that.
right.
So if he can continue to improve those other skill sets, that's where, he's going to get a lot more minutes, might even close games. And like you said, then eventually down the line, he could be the starting, forward for the Rockets, right? Because,
Easily.
inevitably at some point, Houston's going to have to decide what's our real core, right? Because we already know, at least right now, right? Jabari Smith Jr. is going to be part of that core, right? And then presumably, at least one of Şengün or Jalen Green, if not both. And then after that, who else, right? Because the other guys are improving, but we still have to see it before they're ultimately truly penciled in.
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah. So, either way, regardless, let us know your thoughts in the comments on, the Houston Rockets and, what you think of them. But now in terms of news and rumors, not really a ton to get into, but there was one big story that happened over the week, and that was Adrian Wojnarowski, right? Legendary, sports journalist, right? He has decided to retire from covering, sports news, right? So obviously, if you hadn't already heard, right, he's apparently picked up, an offer to be the general manager of St. Bonaventure's men's basketball, right? That's the school that he attended. when he was a young boy. And so and so obviously, right, it's a different role, right? So, again, obviously we got the legendary Woj bomb memes, right? Because obviously that's been a big part of sports culture for, I mean, I guess a decade or so at this point,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
'Cause obviously, you know, the first time I actually remember him like vividly, I guess, was about 10 or so years ago. I think it was maybe 2015,
yeah,
where it was the 2014-2015 season, and it was that trade deadline where, nothing really happened initially. And then maybe like, with like 30 minutes or so to go, he just puts out one tweet that says, "Good Lord." And then, of course, after that, right, all the trades come out, right? It was, because that was like, the trade where it's like Goran Dragic going to
yeah,
Miami, right? Isaiah Thomas going to Boston and all these other things. And then obviously, like over the years, right, he's become, even bigger. And he, is kind of the lead NBA insider. But it's a big shakeup because obviously, who's the guy after him, at this point, right? Because obviously there are other guys that, are NBA insiders like Shams Charania, Chris Haynes, even Brian Windhorst as well. But it's a major shakeup, right? Because obviously we know he had a lot of relationships with a bunch of people around the league. And, who's the next person to kind of be able to come in and, find some way to cultivate those relationships? Or again, maybe it's just somebody, who was kind of waiting in the wings. It could be Brian Windhorst or, Shams. I think he's, a free agent or whatever. So maybe he comes to ESPN or maybe Chris Haynes comes to ESPN. But, it's a major shakeup.
yeah. It's insane. Like, shout out to Woj for having a crazy career in terms of being an insider and stuff like that. Like you said, the ties and connections and all the memes that he brought us. Were just
Yeah.
magical, really. Um, and yeah, once again, shout out to him for having a great career. And to answer the question, I think it's Shams. That guy has just as many connections, really, just kind of with different
Mhm.
people, I guess you could say. Um,
Yeah.
so
Tended to be regarded as more of a player, I guess, guy.
for sure, yeah. Like he's got like, the ties with Braun, all that stuff. So um that for sure is probably the guy who I'm gonna go with. But Windhorse, I think he's ESPN as well. So he could just
Yeah.
take over all of Woj's uh contacts and stuff like that and connections. So I'm curious to see what it means because I think it is a big deal because yeah, we're kind of gonna be seeing our sources dwindle down a little bit. I feel like
Yeah.
because Woj is very reliable. That's the
Mhm.
thing that sets him apart or set him
Yeah, he's
apart
only
from
had, like,
others.
a handful of yeah, he's only had, like, a handful of times where he ended up not being right, but like you said, he's the lead NBA insider for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just curious, if he ever comes back. I feel like he's gonna come back at some point, but that's neither here nor there. Shout out to him for having a crazy career. And the final Woj bomb was about Woj. How
Yeah,
poetic.
yeah. Yeah, exactly, and then I think the final like, the final NBA related post, I think, was the Isaac Okoro one with the
Yeah.
extension, but like you said, the
Wow, what a
final
way to go out.
Yeah, exactly, because we were waiting for that one, and, we
Yeah.
finally got it, and we
He
talked
broke it.
about it. Yeah, we talked about it, I think, on our last episode, so if you
Mhm.
haven't already done so, check that one out,
Yes,
but,
please.
yeah, that was a big story just because of the fact that nobody really expected it, because I think he had still had 3 years left on his, contract, I think 7 million a year, so, leaving a lot of money on the table, but, again, it's the next, chapter of Woj, I guess,
Yeah.
in the book of Woj, whatever you wanna call it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And then, after that, I mean, you can't really top anything else other than that. It does sound like, according to, the mayor of Philadelphia, it sounds like the Sixers are gonna stay in Philly. There was talk about maybe once their agreement runs out, maybe they might leave, but it sounds like they're gonna stay. So cool.
Bro, that franchise is too historic to leave. That would be like the Lakers leaving LA. Like that's just not going to happen. Like I don't know, but I guess good for them.
Yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments about the Houston Rockets, their offseason, what your expectations are for the team, what your expectations are of Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün, or maybe what your thoughts of Ime Udoka in year two are, right? Does he have, is there an over under for how many times he starts, talking mess about his team, like he was this year? We'll see. But, just let us know. And again, the NBA season is getting closer. Training camp, right? Media day, basically next week.
Yeah.
Preseason starts in about 2 weeks. So, we're starting to get to the beginning of NBA season where we'll actually be able to talk about some real basketball. So
Yeah.
that'll obviously be fun. So continue to join us and like and subscribe to our content in order to, continue to get updates from us and analysis from us and, um, you know, keep growing the channel, right? Like I said, we've blown past our previous goal. We're still trying to get to 100, or excuse me, 500 subs. So, help us out.
Yes,
So we'll
indeed.
see you in the next episode. And again, if you leave a comment, we'll read it at the beginning of the next one.